Emilio Salvatore, Chicago's most ruthless mafia boss. A man who'd ordered hits without flinching and built an empire on fear, froze in the doorway of his own mansion when he saw two children sitting on his marble floor. His 3-year-old son Theo was pushing a silver toy car worth more than most people's rent, circling it around a 4-year-old girl named Bee, who sat quietly clutching a doll she'd found in a dumpster, its arm glued back together, its tiny dress sewn from scraps of her mother's old cleaning uniform. That image cracked something open inside a man who thought he'd buried every weakness years ago. Bee's mother was Jolene, his 27-year-old housekeeper, a woman with a burn scar on her wrist she never stopped hiding, who'd been slipping in and out of his house for nearly 3 years, working 14-hour shifts for $1,200 a month, and he didn't even know her last name. She'd fled an abusive husband in West Virginia with nothing but her daughter and the clothes on her back, and she'd been surviving in silence, right under the roof of the most dangerous man in the city without ever asking for a single thing. Emilio stepped into that room, and the question he asked next came out colder than he intended. But in his world, when a man like him starts asking questions, nobody answers. They hold their breath. If you're already hooked, smash that like button so this story reaches more people. Share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you won't miss what's coming. Because what happens after Emilio looks into Jolene's past will shatter every rule he's ever lived by. And it all begins with a broken doll named Rosie. How long have you worked here? Emilio's voice carried across the vast playroom, not the voice of a father making small talk, but the voice of a man accustomed to giving orders and expecting absolute obedience. Jolene sprang to her feet from the corner where she'd been quietly dusting the bookshelves, her hands hurriedly smoothing the edges of her apron worn thin and faded, her brown eyes widening with fear she couldn't hide. Because in this house, when Emilio Salvatore asked a question he'd never asked before, it rarely ended well for anyone. Almost 3 years, Mr. Salvatore, since before Theo was born, she answered in a low voice, almost a whisper, each word weighed with care as if any one of them could be a trap. Almost 3 years. Emilio repeated the number in his head, feeling its weight press against his chest in a way he hadn't expected. Almost 3 years this woman had moved in and out of his home, mopping the marble floors he crossed every morning, laundering the shirts he wore to meet with capos, cooking meals he ate alone in his office, between calls about territory and money, and he didn't even know her last name. He, a man who knew the origin of every shipment that passed through the port of Chicago, a man who had every capo vetted 3 generations back before letting them sit at his table, knew nothing about the woman who took care of his son every single day. That truth stirred something he rarely felt, a sense of losing control. And the little girl? Emilio asked, his gaze shifting to Bee, who was still sitting on the floor softly singing to her doll, completely unaware that the air in the room had changed. When did she start coming with you? Jolene hesitated, biting her lower lip, knowing the next answer might cost her her job, the only shelter she had in this city. Not from the beginning, sir. At first I left her with Mrs. Ruth, a neighbor in our apartment building. She watched Bee for free out of kindness to us. But Mrs. Ruth passed away 8 months ago, a stroke right in her kitchen, and I had no one else to leave my daughter with. Maggie said I could bring Bee along as long as she stayed quiet and didn't interfere with my work. The name Maggie made Emilio frown, his jaw tightening. Maggie Dunn, the head housekeeper for over 20 years, the woman he trusted to run this estate, had known and hadn't said a word to him. Maggie allowed it but never told me, Emilio said. Not a question but a cold observation. His voice flat, and Jolene recognized the danger in that flatness, because she'd lived long enough around a dangerous man to know that someone didn't have to raise his voice to be terrifying. I asked her not to bother you, Jolene said quickly, her voice trembling slightly, her eyes fixed on Emilio's chest. Not brave enough to meet his gaze, but unwilling to lower her head. You have far more important matters than the life of a maid. The way she said it, calm and resigned, as if it were an obvious truth beyond debate, made something tighten in Emilio's chest that he couldn't name. The life of a maid, he repeated slowly, tasting the bitterness of the words. He walked to the large window overlooking the perfectly manicured garden, the imported French roses whose monthly upkeep cost more than Jolene earned, and he stood there in silence for a long moment with his hands in his pockets, his back to her. You think having a small child and no one to help watch her is just a maid's problem? Jolene lifted her chin, surprised by the tone of the question. It didn't carry anger or irritation, but something else she didn't recognize. because she'd never heard it from any man in her life. "It's my responsibility, Mr. Salvatore. I chose to have B, so I have to find a way to care for her without affecting my work." Emilio turned back to her and truly looked at Jolene for the first time since she'd entered his home almost 3 years earlier, and what he saw forced him to keep his face carefully neutral, a skill he'd practiced his entire life. He saw the deep shadows beneath eyes cheap makeup couldn't hide, the cracked, rough skin on her hands from cleaning chemicals, the uniform always impeccably clean, but faded at the cuffs and elbows, and he saw a young woman, surely not yet 30, carrying a weight that looked far too heavy for such narrow shoulders. "How old are you, Jolene?" The question slipped out before he could stop himself, and she blinked rapidly, clearly unsettled by the sudden attention from a man she was used to glimpsing only at the far end of hallways. 27, sir." 27 years old, a 4-year-old child, nearly 3 years working in his house. Emilio did the math in his head. The numbers didn't align perfectly, but he knew this wasn't the time to press. Not yet. And in his world, patience had always been a sharper weapon than any gun. Theo pushed the silver toy car aside and crawled closer to Bea, the wide eyes of a 3-year-old fixed on the doll she was holding against her chest, and he reached out with his tiny hand to touch its cracked face before asking in the clear voice of a child who knew nothing about tact, "Why is it broken?" The question made Jolene freeze, her gaze snapping to her daughter with a worried look, as if she feared the answer would expose something she'd been trying to hide for so long. But Bea looked up at her mother, and then at Emilio, her 4-year-old eyes blinking as she waited for permission that a child her age shouldn't have to ask for. "Go on, sweetheart," Jolene said softly, her voice gentling as she turned toward her daughter, warm and tender, completely different from the trembling tone she'd used with Emilio just minutes earlier. Bea lifted the doll with both hands, careful as if she were holding a real baby, then smiled at Theo and said, "Rosie isn't broken. Rosie's just tired. Mommy says when someone doesn't get hugged for a very long time, the outside starts to look bad, scratched, cracked, ugly. But inside it's still whole, still full of love." Emilio stood by the window, his body still angled toward the garden. But when those words came from the mouth of a 4-year-old sitting on the cold marble floor of his mansion, he felt them pierce straight through every layer of armor he'd built over more than 20 years in the underworld. Precise and merciless like a bullet fired from close range that he couldn't dodge. He looked at Theo's silver car lying abandoned on the floor, then at the tattered doll in Bea's hands, and for the first time he truly saw that those two toys weren't just objects. They were two completely different worlds, existing side by side on the same floor. He walked across every day without ever looking down. "Bea, may I see Rosie?" Emilio asked, and he lowered himself to the floor, bringing himself level with the children's eyes. An action that anyone in his empire would never believe, because Emilio Salvatore never lowered himself for anyone. Bea looked at her mother again. Jolene nodded even though her hands were clenched together so tightly her knuckles had gone white, and the little girl handed the doll to Emilio with both hands, with the reverence people usually reserve for the most precious things in the world. Emilio took the doll, feeling its feather-light weight in hands that had signed orders to deal with traitors without ever shaking. Hands that were now holding an old piece of plastic a 27-year-old mother had rescued from a trash bin and turned into the most precious thing in her daughter's life. He examined every detail. The doll's arm glued back on, the seam imperfect but strong, the synthetic hair frayed but carefully brushed smooth, and the tiny dress hand sewn with uneven stitches, the fabric cut from an old maid's uniform whose familiar faded blue he recognized immediately. "Who fixed Rosie for you?" Emilio asked, even though he already knew the answer, because he needed to hear it, needed to feel it spoken by this child. "My mommy," Bea replied, her voice brimming with pride in the way only a child who loved her mother with her whole heart could speak. "Mommy found Rosie in the trash behind the building where we live. Rosie was thrown away, but Mommy said everyone deserves to be loved one more time. So Mommy brought Rosie home, glued Rosie's arm back on, brushed Rosie's hair, and then Mommy cut Mommy's old clothes to make Rosie a pretty new dress." Emilio looked at Jolene, who had flushed and turned away, her eyes darting to the floor, the ceiling, the window, anywhere but him. Shame written plainly across her face, as if rescuing a toy from the trash for her child were some kind of crime she needed to hide. "You did this," Emilio said, not as a question. He stood up, gently placing the doll back into Bea's hands, then straightened, his eyes never leaving Jolene. You took a toy from the garbage and turned it into the most precious thing your daughter owns." Jolene finally met his gaze, her chin lifting slightly with a quiet dignity that stood in stark contrast to her humble circumstances, and she answered without her voice trembling, "Yes, sir. I do what I can with what I have. B wanted a doll for a very long time, and I couldn't afford to buy her a new one, so—" She let the sentence trail off, not needing to finish because everything was already clear, and Emilio understood completely, in the way only a man who'd seen poverty before, clawing his way to the top through blood and violence, could understand. That the woman standing in front of him wasn't asking for pity, she was simply doing what a mother had to do, and that simple truth was slowly breaking apart everything he thought he knew about the world. Emilio set the doll down and straightened, sliding both hands into his pockets, pacing slowly across the room, while his mind kept circling the image of a doll's dress, cut from an old uniform, and he asked in a calm voice, each word measured with the same care he used when interrogating a traitor, "How many hours do you work each day, Jolene?" She answered immediately, without hesitation, as if the number were etched into her memory because it was the very rhythm of her life. "From 5 in the morning to 7 at night, Mr. Salvatore. Sometimes later if there are guests for dinner, or when Theo needs extra care. 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, 84 hours a week," Emilio calculated in his head, his throat tightening despite his effort to keep his face unreadable. "And on your day off, what do you do?" Jolene smiled, a small, weary smile Emilio had never seen on anyone during his years at the top of Chicago's underworld, because it held no strain or pretense, only the pure resignation of someone long accustomed to having nothing for herself. "I don't have much free time, sir. On my only day off, I do laundry for the two of us, cook meals for the whole week to save money on eating out, then take B to the community clinic in Englewood for free checkups. Each visit I have to line up from 6 in the morning just to get a number. Sometimes we wait until noon to be called. B falls asleep on my lap in the waiting line, but at least she gets seen by a doctor." Emilio turned his back to the garden, not because he wanted the view, but because he didn't want Jolene to see what was crossing his face now. Something he hadn't allowed anyone to witness since he was a 14-year-old boy in Little Italy. He thought of the dinner the week before at Alinea, where he'd spent more than $2,000 on a table for 4 with partners he didn't even trust, nearly twice Jolene's monthly pay, where he'd drunk a bottle of wine worth more than she earned in 3 weeks of labor, and while he'd been chewing Wagyu beef dusted with truffle, she'd been cooking instant noodles for her daughter in some miserable studio apartment whose location he didn't even know. "Do you have health insurance?" he asked, still facing away. "No, sir." Jolene's voice was flat. "Does B?" "No, sir. The community clinic is our only option." Emilio clenched his hands in his pockets until his nails pressed into his palms, and he asked the next question in a tone only Gianni would recognize as the one he used when holding back an impending eruption of rage. "Your documents. Are they all in order?" The silence stretched long enough for Emilio to know the answer before Jolene spoke. "I used a different name when I came to Chicago, sir," she said, her voice dropping. "Jolene Whitfield is my real name, but all the documents I used to apply for work here, my driver's license, my social security card, they're under another name. I had to do it so that people couldn't find me." She didn't say who those people were, and Emilio didn't ask, but his eyes flicked to her wrist, where a burn scar rose beneath the sleeve of her uniform, when she unconsciously lifted a hand to smooth her hair, and he understood. He understood in the way a man who'd spent his life dealing in violence understands, that the scar didn't come from a stove or an accident. It came from someone's hand meant to inflict pain. Emilio turned back to face Jolene, and in that moment, seeing her standing in the room flooded with afternoon light through the glass, one hand gripping her apron to hide the scar, eyes fixed straight ahead with the quiet stubbornness of someone long used to being knocked down by life, and still getting up every morning, he grasped a cruel irony that he would have dismissed as fiction if he weren't living it himself. That this woman was a ghost, a person who existed in no official record, with no real name, no insurance, no papers, no family, no one who knew where she was or who she was, and the place she'd chosen to disappear from the world was the home of the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, the very man every ghost should have avoided. But she hadn't avoided him. She'd stepped inside, bowed her head, scrubbed floors, cooked meals, cared for his son, and hidden in plain sight before his eyes for almost 3 years without him ever knowing, and that truth didn't just make Emilio angry with himself. It stirred something more dangerous than anger. a respect for a woman he'd never bothered to truly see. That night, after Jolene took Bea home, and the mansion sank into the thick silence Emilio had once found comforting but now felt strangely heavy, he sat at his desk in a room, lit only by a single desk lamp, and called Gianni Ferraro, his right hand, the 43-year-old man who'd stood by him since the earliest days, and the only person alive who dared speak bluntly to Emilio Salvatore without fear. "I need you to investigate someone," Emilio said, his voice flat like water before a storm. "Jolene Whitfield, 27, from West Virginia, who's been working in my house for almost 3 years under a false name. I want everything. All of it. Before noon tomorrow." Gianni didn't ask why. He never did when Emilio used that tone, and by 10 the next morning, a thick file lay on Emilio's desk. Gianni stood opposite him, arms crossed, his face set in a way Emilio recognized as bad news. Real name, Jolene Marie Whitfield, born in a small town called Beckley, West Virginia, married at 22 to Wade Buckley, 32, with a record for assault and federal-level methamphetamine distribution, but only received probation due to lack of evidence. Police records show 3 calls from Jolene to 911 for domestic violence. All 3 charges later withdrawn. Last hospital admission was for broken ribs and a second-degree burn on her left wrist. Gianni paused briefly, then continued. She fled when Bea was about 1 year old, took all the cash Wade kept in the house, around $3,000, and vanished. Wade reported to police that she stole his money, not that his wife was missing. He reported the cash, not her. Since then, he's hired people to look for her. He's currently in Huntington, West Virginia, but his men have been asking around the Midwest, and at least one is active in Chicago. He knows she's somewhere in the city, but hasn't pinned down the exact address. Emilio read every page, studied the photographs of injuries in the medical reports, the broken ribs, the iron-shaped burn on her wrist, the bruising around her neck, and he felt a kind of anger unlike any he'd known before. Not the cold, calculated anger he used to run an empire, but a hot, primitive fury he'd thought he'd killed long ago. He closed the file and looked at Gianni. "Does this Wade Buckley know where she's working?" "Not yet, but it's only a matter of time, boss. She doesn't have professional survival skills. She's just a mother running on instinct, and instinct always makes mistakes eventually." Emilio nodded slowly, his fingers tapping the oak desktop in a steady rhythm Gianni knew meant he was planning. That night, when the house was dark, Emilio went into Theo's bedroom, something he rarely did because he usually came home too late after long meetings in smoke-filled rooms on the south side of the city. The boy lay curled in a bed 4 times larger than necessary for a 3-year-old. Silk blankets slipped to the floor, a silver Lamborghini toy by the pillow, but Theo's small arms weren't wrapped around the car. They were clutching a pillow, and in his sleep the child murmured a single word. "Joe." Emilio stood motionless by his son's bed, watching those small lips form the name of the maid instead of calling for his mother, and something painful and shameful tightened in his throat. His son, a child who had everything money could buy, a child Priscilla had given birth to, and then handed off so she could return to a Manhattan penthouse and its parties and designer handbags. That child was calling Jolene's name in his dreams, because Jolene was the one who held him when he cried, sang to him when he was afraid, sat by his bed when he was sick, all the things his mother should have done, or at the very least he should have done, but both of them were absent, and a woman earning scraps had quietly filled the space they'd left behind without ever asking for recognition. Emilio pulled the blanket back over Theo, watched him a moment longer, then stepped out and called Gianni again, his voice no longer flat but carrying the weight of an order that couldn't be questioned. "Assign 2 men to follow and protect Jolene and the child every night when she leaves here. Quietly. She can't know. Starting tonight." The next morning, Emilio told Maggie to send Jolene to his office the moment she arrived. And Maggie looked at him with worry but didn't dare ask, only nodded and walked away, because she'd worked in this house long enough to know that when Emilio Salvatore summoned someone into that room, it was about something he'd never seen Emilio think about before. "Gianni," Emilio finally said, his voice not an order but the voice of a man speaking honestly to the only friend he had. "For the first time in my life, I need to become someone worthy." Gianni didn't ask worthy of whom or what, because he'd seen Emilio kneel in a dark hallway to wipe blood from Jolene's mouth. And he already knew the answer. With Wade behind bars and Jolene finally free, Emilio turned to the remaining problem, Priscilla. The meeting took place at Franklin Ashford's law office in the Loop, on the 42nd floor overlooking Lake Michigan, and Priscilla arrived dressed in black as if for a funeral, her face cold, the Kensington family's private attorney close at her side. She sat across from Emilio at the polished wooden table and spoke first, her voice sharp as a razor, saying her family wouldn't allow him to tear apart the alliance over a maid and her child. Emilio didn't answer immediately. He nodded slightly to Franklin, and Franklin opened a black briefcase and placed 3 thick folders on the table, each clearly labeled. The first contained a detailed record of funds Priscilla had secretly transferred from the Salvatore family's joint accounts to a private Swiss account over the past 2 years, totaling more than $300,000, money that by the unwritten laws of their world belonged to the alliance, not to her personally. The second held records of calls Priscilla made to 2 rival families in Detroit, calls whose contents showed she'd shared internal details about Emilio's transport routes to bargain for her own position should the alliance collapse. The third documented Priscilla's systematic absence from Theo's life, including schedules showing that over 3 years she'd spent fewer than 40 days with her son, along with a child psychologist's report detailing Theo's insecure attachment before Jolene began caring for him. Priscilla stared at the folders as the color drained from her face, and her attorney skimmed them before leaning in to whisper urgently, his expression tightening by the second. Emilio spoke evenly, saying that if those documents reached her father, Victor would learn his daughter hadn't only betrayed her husband but the alliance itself, and she knew how her father dealt with betrayal. There was no need to explain. The room fell silent, the wall clock ticking steadily, and Priscilla looked at Emilio with eyes where arrogance gave way to desperate calculation, knowing he wasn't bluffing because Emilio Salvatore never bluffed. 20 minutes later, she signed the divorce papers, her pen pressing so hard it nearly tore the page, accepting every term, Emilio retaining full custody of Theo. Priscilla allowed weekly video calls but barred from approaching the child without written consent, and granted a financial settlement sufficient to live on but not to cause harm. She stood, looked at Emilio one last time, and said she hoped the woman was worth everything he was destroying, then turned and left, her heels clicking across the marble floor for the final time, and 3 days later she flew back to New York, and then on to Paris, disappearing from Emilio and Theo's lives as if she'd never existed. That same week, Emilio asked Gianni to find an apartment for Jolene, and Gianni, who'd followed his boss through blood and bullets, now spent his afternoons touring homes for the woman who'd stopped being just a maid a long time ago. They viewed 4 apartments in one afternoon, Jolene inspecting each detail with a care Emilio observed in silence, twisting faucets, flipping light switches, checking window locks, calculating distances to Bee's school, the bus stop, the nearest grocery store. The third apartment in Lincoln Park had 2 bedrooms, clean white walls, old but solid wood floors, and a living room window overlooking a small park with a children's playground. And when Bee ran to the window and looked out, she shouted in a voice Emilio would remember for a long time, asking if there were swings and if they could really live there. Jolene stood in the empty living room with her hand against the white wall, looking around with the eyes of someone who'd never had a place to call home. The house in West Virginia had been Wade's prison, the South Side studio, a temporary hideout, but this could be home for the first time in her life. She said it was perfect, then looked at Emilio and said the rent was $1,800 a month, and she couldn't afford it on her own. Emilio was ready. He handed her the agreement Franklin had prepared, $1,500 in monthly housing support as an official employment benefit, Jolene paying the remainder from her salary, everything in writing, with legal signatures and clear terms, no verbal promises. Jolene read every line slowly and carefully as she had in Emilio's office before, then looked up and said she'd repay every dollar if one day she no longer worked for him. Emilio nodded, thinking that in all the negotiations of his life, from million-dollar deals to ceasefires between families, he'd never respected the person across the table more than he did in that moment. The months that followed brought a new rhythm neither Emilio nor Jolene had imagined when everything began. Jolene moved into the Lincoln Park apartment, and for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to hang photographs on the walls, because before she never did. Hanging photos meant staying, and staying meant being found. But now Wade was behind bars, and she didn't have to run anymore. She furnished the apartment with simple second-hand pieces, a pale blue fabric sofa she inspected 3 times before buying because she couldn't quite believe she was allowed to spend money on something that wasn't a necessity. A small wooden kitchen table, cheap pine bookshelves. She assembled herself following YouTube instructions. And in Bee's room, She set up a study corner with a child-sized desk and chair, colored pencils, drawing paper, and a bed of her own that Bea jumped on all evening because she'd never had one before. Rosie was placed at the head of Bea's bed beside the books Emilio bought her each week, the worn old doll resting among brand new things like a quiet reminder of where they'd come from. A week after settling in, Jolene went to the Malcolm X Community Education Center on Stewart to enroll in the evening GED program, standing at the registration counter gripping the pen because she'd dropped out of school at 17 when she met Wade, and returning to a classroom after 10 years frightened her more than the nights she'd spent running in the rain. But she filled out the form anyway, and wrote her real name, Jolene Marie Whitfield, in a shaky but clear hand, because she didn't have to hide anymore. Emilio arranged for Maggie to watch Bea at the apartment on the nights Jolene had class, 3 evenings a week from 6 to 9, and Maggie arrived each time with a basket of homemade cookies, reading to Bea while Jolene headed out with a backpack that made her look both excited and ready to bolt. Jolene studied harder than anyone in her class, sitting in the front row, filling notebooks, asking the instructor questions after every session, then going home to read until her eyes wouldn't stay open, because she understood this might be her only chance, and she wouldn't waste it. 4 months later, Jolene passed the GED with high marks, standing in the center hallway, staring at the word pass, until it blurred through tears, then calling Emilio, the first time she'd ever called him for a reason unrelated to work or danger, her voice trembling with joy as she said she'd passed. And Emilio paused before replying that he knew she would, his tone as even as ever but warmer beneath the calm. Jolene enrolled the following term in an early childhood education program at City Colleges of Chicago, wanting to become a preschool teacher and spend her life caring for children like Bea, children from places no one noticed, and she would do it with a degree bearing her real name. While Jolene rebuilt her life brick by brick, Emilio was changing in his own way, quietly but deeply. One evening he called Gianni and Franklin into his office and told them he wanted to legitimize the Salvatore Empire, not all at once and not completely, but gradually and methodically. Gianni looked at him as if he'd spoken another language, but Franklin, the sharp lawyer who'd served the family for 2 decades, nodded and said he'd been waiting for this day. Emilio opened high-end Italian restaurants in River North, invested in commercial real estate in the West Loop, formed a legitimate construction company, and began moving money from shadow into light. He scaled back illegal operations, handed certain routes to his capos under strict conditions, and started coming home every evening at 6 instead of midnight, eating in the kitchen with Theo. And sometimes, when Jolene and Bea joined them for dinner, the 4 of them sat around the table looking more like a family than any photograph Emilio had ever taken with Priscilla. They were both rebuilding themselves, Jolene through textbooks and evening lectures, Emilio through business contracts and decisions the capos whispered about, but never challenged, each on a separate path yet driven by the same unspoken reason they both felt, becoming worthy of the family they had, worthy of the 2 children growing up side by side, and perhaps, though neither dared admit it yet, worthy of each other. Nearly a year after the afternoon, Emilio had frozen in the doorway, watching 2 children sit on the marble floor. A winter storm slammed into Chicago with a force the Weather Service called the worst in 20 years, winds over 100 kilometers per hour whipping across Lake Michigan and driving waves onto the shore, hail pounding the mansion roof like gunfire, and at 9 o'clock the entire Gold Coast power grid went dead, plunging the house into total darkness. Jolene and Bea were at the mansion that night because Jolene had been scheduled for a late shift, preparing for a weekend event that was ultimately canceled due to the storm. And when the lights went out and thunder cracked hard enough to shake the glass walls, Theo screamed from his bedroom and ran through the dark hallway straight into Emilio's room, small feet slipping on the cold stone floor as he leapt onto the bed and clung to his father, face buried in Emilio's chest, his body shuddering with every rumble. Minutes later, Jolene appeared in the doorway carrying Bea, the child crying with both arms wrapped tight around Rosie. And Jolene said apologetically that Bea was terrified, and she didn't know where else to take her because the downstairs rooms were pitch black. Emilio sat up with Theo still clinging to him and said they should come in and go camping. He fumbled through a drawer and found the box of candles Maggie always kept for emergencies, lit 4 of them, and placed them on the nightstand and bookshelf, the golden flames dancing on the walls and turning the vast dark bedroom into a warm, mysterious cave. Emilio spread extra blankets on the bed and settled Theo and Bea between them. The children curled together, eyes still wide whenever thunder rolled, and Bea looked up and asked him to tell a story, because her mother said stories made fear smaller. Emilio had never told a story to anyone in his life. He wasn't that kind of man. But two round faces stared up at him in candlelight, and he began in a low voice that surprised him with its softness, telling of a girl named B and a boy named T, who lived in a big city, and the girl had a magical doll named Rosie, who could talk whenever the moon rose. And every night the three of them flew through storms to a land where no one was afraid, and no one was alone, where every crack was healed, and every child was loved. The story had no real plot. Emilio invented it as he went, but the children listened rapt, B's eyes lighting up whenever Rosie appeared, Theo giggling when the boy T rode the doll through the clouds, and gradually the thunder outside faded into distant background noise. Eyelids grew heavy, heavier, then closed, B falling asleep first with Rosie in her arms, Theo following with his head resting on Emilio's arm, the two children lying side by side on the wide bed, peaceful as if the storm didn't exist. Jolene sat on the edge of the bed the entire time Emilio spoke, silent and watching, seeing the hand that once signed orders in the underworld patting bees back to sleep, hearing the voice that made bosses tremble, spinning a fairy tale about a magical doll, and she felt the final wall in her chest, the one she'd built for years to keep any man out, begin to crack. She said he was a good father, using his name without the formal title before she realized it had slipped out, and she didn't correct herself, letting it remain raw and real. Emilio looked at her, her face half lit by candlelight and half in shadow, and thought that was exactly how he'd seen her from the beginning, a woman existing between two worlds, between the darkness of her past and the light she was creating for herself every day. He said it was because of her. Jolene shook her head and said she was just there. Emilio was quiet for a moment, listening to rain on the windows and the steady breathing of two sleeping children. Then he lifted his hand to her face, slowly and gently, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, but she didn't. She stayed still and let his palm rest against her cheek, warm and steady. He told her she was there when no one else was, that she cared for the most precious thing in his life before he even knew how precious it was, that he loved her, her strength, her tenderness, the way she found light in every darkness. Jolene searched his eyes for pity, for fleeting compassion, for any sign this was only a storm night emotion, but found only honesty, the kind she thought no longer existed. She told him she was just a former housekeeper with a child, and he could have anyone. He placed a finger on her lips, and said she was the strongest person he'd ever known, and if she accepted, he wanted to be B's father, and wanted them to be a real family. Jolene cried, tears sliding over his fingers on her cheek. But these were different tears, not the kind shed in a dark hallway or on the floor of an abandoned church. These were the tears of someone finally allowed to stop and be loved, and she leaned into his hand and kissed him, softly and trembling, by candlelight, amid the storm, with two children sleeping beside them, and the kiss tasted of tears and promises, of a past released, and a future that finally had shape. 2 years after that stormy night, on an April Sunday morning, when early spring sunlight streamed through the living room windows of the Salvatore mansion, Emilio sat on the rug amid a spread of Lego bricks with Theo, now 5, and B, now 6, the three of them building a castle B had designed from her imagination, with a tall tower for a princess, a special room for dolls, and a large gate that Theo insisted needed 2 guards, because every castle needed protection. Right, Dad? And Emilio nodded, smiling at his son's earnest seriousness, thinking that 2 years ago this child hadn't even known how to smile. Jolene came in from the kitchen, carrying a tray of fruit juice, her belly round and full at 6 months pregnant with her and Emilio's first child together, set the tray down, then sat on the sofa watching the three of them play, her face now completely changed. No more deep shadows under her eyes, no more cracked hands from harsh chemicals, no more wild look of an animal cornered with no escape, replaced instead by the warm brown eyes of a woman who had finally been allowed to rest, to be loved, and who was nearing the end of her 2nd year studying early childhood education, with one of the highest grade point averages in her class. The burn scar was still on her wrist, but she no longer hid it. She let it remain as part of herself, because a crack didn't mean broken. As B placed the final Lego piece atop the tower, Theo's gaze drifted to the oak shelf beside the fireplace, where Rosie lay inside a glass display case Emilio had custom made, a clear case set on red velvet, with Rosie inside, her glued arm, her dress sewn from an old uniform, her synthetic hair worn but carefully brushed, The ragged doll once pulled from a trash bin now displayed like a treasure in a multi-million-dollar home. "Dad, why does Rosie have to stay in the glass box?" Theo asked, looking up at his father with the pure curiosity of a 5-year-old. Emilio looked at his son, then at Bea, then at Jolene on the sofa with one hand resting on her pregnant belly, and he smiled. A smile no one on earth would have believed Emilio Salvatore capable of 2 years earlier. "Rosie's there to remind us that love heals everything, son," he said. "The most valuable things in life aren't the expensive ones. They're the ones made with the whole heart." Bea heard that and smiled because she understood completely. She'd lived that story herself. Then she stood and ran to her mother, resting her head on Jolene's shoulder, and Jolene kissed her daughter's hair, while her other hand stayed on her belly where the baby kicked softly. Emilio looked at his family. Theo back to stacking Lego, Bea whispering something to her mother's belly. Jolene smiling with that warm gaze he never grew tired of watching. And he knew that the broken doll in the glass case was the most precious gift that had ever entered this house. He, Emilio Salvatore, the most ruthless mafia boss in Chicago, the man who'd built an empire on fear and absolute power in the underworld, had finally found the one thing no amount of money, no power, no empire could ever buy. A real family, born from the courage to see beyond appearances, from the resilience of a mother who pulled a doll from the trash and sewed clothes for her child, from the cry of a child calling a housekeeper's name in her sleep, and from a first kiss by candlelight in the middle of a storm. The maid's daughter and the boss's son no longer existed as separate worlds, only siblings, children of a family where every member had once been broken, once been hurt, once been abandoned by the world, but had found each other and healed one another with the simplest and most powerful thing in existence, love. This story reminds all of us that it doesn't matter where you come from or how heavy the past you carry may be, because when two people choose to build something real together, they create a kind of wealth no money on earth can buy. And that wealth is a true family, a place where every crack can be healed and everyone deserves to be loved one more time. If this story touched your heart, please like and share this video so more people can hear it. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the stories we bring you each day. We'd truly love to know how you felt after hearing this story. Whether it made you think of someone in your own life or reminded you of a moment when love changed everything, please share your feelings from the depths of your heart in the comments below. We read every word and cherish them all. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace, and happiness every single day. Goodbye and see you again in the next video.